This is military history. The Zulus are coming.
In many respects, Rorke's Drift was a small and unimportant affair, fought out in an obscure corner of the empire by men who, in truth, need not have fought at all.
In the 1870s, Southern Africa was a very problematic part of the world for the British Empire. The British had two colonies there, the Cape Colony and Natal, and they'd had all sorts of problems with the various Boer republics inland and various African groups scattered between them. Now, in the 1870s, they adopted a new forward policy, which was attempting to sort out something of this political mess and to pave the way for future economic expansion in the region. And they sent out a new proconsul, Sir Henry Edward Bartle Frere, who was sent out specifically with the intention of implementing a new policy called Confederation. And the whole idea behind Confederation was to bring these various groups under British control, whether they wanted to or not. Now, Frere, very soon after arriving in Southern Africa, decided that one of the quickest ways to bring this about was to force a war on the Zulu kingdom.
It's one of the few conflicts in history where it's almost one man's decision to go to war with the Zulus. It could easily have been avoided, the whole conflict. But Bartle Frere had a point to prove, and by every power in his means he was going to do that.
He had a great theory of turbulent frontiers, which went back to his experience in India, and he decided that the Zulu were a major menace to British security in the region. He once described them as a nation of celibate, man-slaying gladiators, and took extraordinary measures in order to contain this menace.
So he presented King Cetshwayo with an ultimatum. The ultimatum demanded the dismantling of the Zulu military system, which meant the dismantling of Zulu culture. Bartle Frere knew that Cetshwayo could not accept an ultimatum that demanded that he dismantle his own culture. Bartle Frere set up the conditions which would allow him to invade Zululand.
The British government in London did not share Frere's enthusiasm, and would send him no further reinforcements to precipitate a war the British government did not want. The last regular troops to reach him, therefore, were the 2nd Battalion of the 24th 2nd Warwickshire Regiment. The 1st Battalion of the 24th had been at the Cape since 1874. Both battalions were to play a major role in these historic events. The arrival of the 2nd Battalion, 24th, brought the British regular army in the Cape up to 5,400 men. They were reinforced by various native troops and volunteer formations, making some 10,000 in total. Lord Chelmsford, the British commander, organised his army into 5 columns. 3 columns were to enter Zululand at different points, while 2 would remain behind to guard against Zulu incursions.
Napoleon Bonaparte had a slogan. He said, "March divided, fight united." And that was what Lord Chelmsford was trying to do. He wanted to advance his columns separately so that each could be logistically independent. He intended to come to Ulundi, to King Cetshwayo's own capital, and fight united at Ulundi. So from that point of view, the division of Lord Chelmsford's force is sound and understandable. The problem was that it also weakened his already weak force by dividing it up. So it was a good way to move, but it was a bad way to fight.
Each infantry battalion needed at least 16 ox wagons. Each one of those wagons was pulled by 16 oxen. In the end, he needed some 10,000 oxen. This was a very slow and very cumbersome process of moving people around.
Also, his Chelmsford's intelligence system was extremely primitive. He had very little idea about Zulu deployments within Zululand. By contrast, Cetshwayo had deployed a number of Zulu inverted commas spies into Natal and was fully aware of British preparations and the location of the 3 invading columns.
On the 9th of January, Lord Chelmsford and Lieutenant Colonel Glynn, with the 3rd Column, approached the Mzinzathi River, which formed the border with Zululand. They pitched camp at Rorkes Drift, known to the Zulus as Kwa Jim, after the former owner, Jim Rorke. In due course, a small military post was established by Assistant Commissariat Officer Walter Dunn, along with Acting Assistant Commissary James Dalton and storekeeper Lewis Byrne. In 1879, the settlement at the Drift consisted of 2 small stone buildings with thatched roofs and, beside them, a kraal. This was now the property of a Swedish missionary named Otto Witt. Having sent his family to safety, Witt, who spoke Zulu, had stayed behind to act as an interpreter. He did this in the hope that his small action might prevent needless bloodshed. As a man of God, he knew and respected the Zulus. But in his hope for a peaceful accommodation, he was to be disappointed. On the 11th of January, the time limit on the governor's ultimatum ran out, and the main body of the column moved on from Rorkes Drift into Zululand. Cetshwayo was now at war with the might of the British Empire, and Lord Chelmsford intended to carry the war to him.
The Zulu forces were organised in regiments, but they were very different regiments from the type we're used to in the British Army. Each one was called an Ibutu, and what this meant was that men in their late teens were gathered together by the king and then separated from the rest of society, trained together. Indeed, they weren't even allowed to get married until their late 30s. That was the plan anyway. It was devised by the first great Zulu king, Shaka.
These regiments were dispersed throughout Zululand, and they had their own logistical resources. They had their own communities, their own cattle. And when the king required them to fight, he would send messengers, and the regiment would be sent out as part of an army.
The Zulu army was a very sophisticated form of spear and shield armed tribal force. The difference between it and other tribal armies in southern Africa was its discipline, its tactical cohesion, and its ability to follow instructions during a battle. The difference between it and the British Army was simply immense.
The British Army, of course, was a professional standing army of volunteers, and it was equipped with the very, very latest and most modern weapons. There was an enormous disparity between the two.
The Zulu outnumbered the British forces going to Zululand and probably made up for their lack of technical capability. Initial numbers were around 20,000, and probably the maximum number of forces could reach 50,000.
Initially, the British went into the Zulu War convinced that the best way to defeat the Zulus in the field was to employ open order, extended tactics. This was based on the assumption that what was necessary was to maximise their firepower, basically by simply lining the redcoats up in a long line and blasting away.
With the departure of the column for the interior of Zululand, a detachment of about 300 men of the Natal native contingent remained behind at the Drift. Other than the red bands, which marked them apart from the Zulus, they were armed and equipped identically. However, their will to fight was considerably less than their fearsome adversary. Also present were the 80 men of B Company of the 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment, who took up guard duty under Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead. By the river, Lieutenant John Chard, a subaltern in the Royal Engineers, was working with a small detachment to maintain the bridge, which had been used to make the crossing. With the arrival of Surgeon James Reynolds, Witt's home was now converted, this time into a hospital to serve the needs of Lieutenant Colonel Glynn's column as they moved into Zululand. Rorkes Drift was under the overall command of Major Spaulding, the Chief Supply Officer. With the main column gone, there was little of note to report. On the 22nd of January, after an eventful 10 days, Spaulding decided to ride back to help Makar, to see why promised reinforcements had not arrived. Before leaving, he handed over command to Lieutenant Chard, with what must possibly rank as the most misguided intelligence briefing in military history. "I see you are senior, so you will be in charge. Although, of course, nothing will happen, and I shall be back again this evening."
I think the criticism of Major Spaulding is more a modern view than those of contemporaries. I mean, he'd set out from Rorkes Drift to try and find out what had happened to G Company of the 1st 24th. And in fact, as he left, he said he didn't expect anything to happen.
He was wrong. Humans are wrong all the time. You cannot criticize somebody because he's fallible.
Unfortunately, history is very unkind to certain figures, and Spaulding, after Rorkes Drift, certainly suffered a great deal of innuendo and rumour which suggested that he'd left the post deliberately, and obviously that's not the case.
I think Spaulding's presence was hardly relevant. Had he been there, he would have doubtless done a perfectly good professional job, but it would have made little difference to the outcome of the battle.
Major Spaulding had not been gone for more than a few hours when 2 riders brought news from the 3rd Column's camp at Isandlwana. In one of the greatest reverses suffered by the British Army in the entire Victorian era, the camp at Isandlwana had been attacked and overrun. "1,300 British troops and their African allies were killed. Worse still, fresh news now arrived that a 2nd Zulu army was heading towards Rorkes Drift, intent on dealing the same hard lesson to the small band of defenders at the former mission station. Lieutenant Bromhead at once struck his camp and sent down for Lieutenant Chard, who was engaged with some half a dozen men at the ponts on the river, to come up and direct the preparations for defence. Lieutenant Chard consulted both Bromhead and Commissary Dalton, who was an ex-quartermaster sergeant. Dalton's advice was particularly sound. He urged Chard to stay and fight rather than try to outrun the oncoming enemy.
In the remote mountains of British Columbia lies evidence of one of the US military's most closely guarded secrets.
The size of the debris field is just incredible.
US Air Force went in to a crash site of one of their aircraft and destroyed it. Why? What were they trying to hide?
It's just better not talk about things like that.
Lost Nuke, next Friday at 10 on Military History.
VO5 Extreme Style. Break the mold.
free with the Daily Mirror and Sunday Mirror, the David Attenborough Essential Collection, featuring 14 free DVDs.
They have to warm up.
With episodes from Life in Cold Blood, The Blue Planet and many more, plus wildlife posters and stickers. Offer starts this weekend with 3 episodes from Life of Mammals. Get your 14 free DVDs and bring the wild into your home. The Daily Mirror. Real news, real entertainment.
Who is Les Grossman? No, you want the goodies? Ben Stiller. Jack Black.
Yeah, man!
Robert Downey Jr.
You're supposed to be a unit. Suck my unit.
And introducing Les Grossman.
Diet Coke! Get him a Diet Coke.
Tropic Thunder.
Leia.
In the year 1366, people feared terrible dangers. They believed the earth was flat and the sun set into the sea. So when the citizens of Leuven set out to create the perfect beer, they risked all to gather the ingredients. And today the beer still contains only the same 4 precious ingredients. Dare you brave the dangers they faced? Take the challenge of 1366 at stellaartois.com.
It's not that easy being green.
Our problems are man-made.
Having to spend each day.
Therefore, they can be solved by man.
By 2020, EDF Energy aim to reduce the intensity of CO2 emissions from their electricity production by 60%. To reduce your carbon footprint, go to savetoday, savetomorrow.com.
Here, in this village, neighbours have accused a local man of committing polygamy.
I have lived here for 20 years. To think this has been going on right under my nose. All those different meats.
I'm a man. I cannot be tied to just one meat.
Well, my husband is a one-meat man.
This is perfectly natural. You, I bet your bloke fancies a bit of this, really, doesn't he?
Polygamy. Should it be illegal or should it be lunch? You decide. Pup.
Meat Beast Whopper, 100% flame grilled beef, pepperoni and bacon. Have your meat and eat it.
Do you have an old mobile phone that's just lying around? Why not visit mazumamobile.com, find out how much it's worth, and exchange it for cash? Turning your old mobile into cash with mazumamobile.com couldn't be easier. Simply tell us what make and model you have, post us your phone, and we could pay up to £100 for it. So go on, what are you waiting for? Magic your old phone into cash with mazumamobile.com today.
Well, we get along, yeah, we really do, and there's nothing wrong, what I feel for you.
Join bet365bingo.com today and get £10 free. No deposit required. Calling all bingo heads. Play now at bet365bingo.com.
Oh, I just adore the freshness of nature. Oh, come on! Oh, never mind. My home smells just as lovely thanks to new Airwick Aqua Essences. Inspired by plants grown in water, they make my home smell wonderfully fresh. I just love the freshness of nature. Most of the time. New Aqua Essences from Airwick. It's good to be home. Ooh, and try Aqua Essences fragrances in all these Airwick products.
Rich hair color in just 10 minutes. That's new. And hair that feels stronger. That's even better.
Discover new XL10 from L'Oreal, our first ever permanent hair color that works in 10 minutes and leaves hair feeling stronger.
How?
The unique formula colors in 10 minutes. The cashmere balm gives conditioning protection, while the comb makes coloring even faster.
And grays? Forgotten. In just 10 minutes, captivating color.
New XL10 from L'Oreal Paris, permanent hair color that works in 10 minutes and leaves hair feeling stronger.
Because you're worth it.
It was certainly a wise decision not to try and make a run for Helpmacar with the Zulus fast on their trail. There's no doubt that with the wounded men in the wagons, they wouldn't have stood a chance of reaching safety before the Zulu regiments reached them.
And if they tried, they would be in the position of having a lot of wounded people in ox carts moving very slowly on poor roads, completely exposed to a Zulu attack.
And in fact, what happened on the day was just as the wagons were being hitched up, the Zulus appeared. So really, the defenders of Rorkes Drift were stuck.
As soon as the garrison at Rorkes Drift heard that they were about to be attacked by the Zulus, their immediate reaction was that they were stuck in this awful position with no preparations for defence whatsoever. Henry Hook later recalled, "We were trapped like rats in a hole." In fact, with the cold, analytical mind of hindsight, Rorkes Drift was actually not a bad defensive position, given the sort of attack the British could expect from the Zulus. Of the two buildings, both had thatched roofs, which was a major disadvantage, but they were only about 30 yards apart, making it relatively easy to construct a defensive wall between them. The wagons which were to carry the wounded were now added to the barricades hurriedly being built between the hospital and the storehouse. Quickly and effectively, the defence was erected. Even though it was hastily constructed from stacks of meal biscuit boxes and overturned wagons, the barricade was to prove its deadly efficiency later in the day.
Rorkes Drift turned out to be a very sound defensive position indeed, not least because of the number of mealie bags that were available to turn into a defensive perimeter and the wagons that could be overturned, but also because of the small rocky ledge, which actually meant that as the defences were built on top of the rocky ledge, the defenders were a good 7 feet higher than the attacking Zulus. So it was actually a little miniature fortress that was perfectly suited in many respects to the action that was about to be fought.
True, it was overlooked by bluffs nearby, but in fact they were out of range of effective Zulu musketry.
This was quite a formidable obstacle for anyone attacking it armed with just a short spear and a shield. The buildings themselves, particularly at the back, had very little in the way of doors and windows. The garrison were able to knock loopholes through, so that effectively they were firing from behind solid walls with just little gaps to fire through. Around the mission, there was little room for the Zulus to maneuver. There was some ground in front which had trees and bush on it, which was awkward for the defenders, but in fact, there was a bit of a killing zone generally all around the buildings, within 30 or 40 yards in most cases. With all hope of escape gone, the wounded and sick men were taken back to their places inside and the other patients brought in from the veranda. It was a move that would save some lives, but at a considerable cost. Although it was not good, the situation did not yet look desperate for Chard and his men. There were, after all, some 300 men to defend the perimeter. But as final preparations were made, there was a new and desperate turn of events. Work on the barricade had been proceeding apace, and the men of the 24th laboured alongside the troops of the Natal native contingent. As soon as news arrived that the Zulus were on their way, the native troops bolted from their post, leaving their regular comrades to their fate. They may have struck fear into the NNC, but by attacking even the lightly held mission station, the Zulu regiments who attacked Rorkes Drift were ignoring the only really valuable piece of tactical advice their king had given them, for he had advised them not to attack the British in defended positions.
The matter is in your hands, he told us. But if you come near to the white man and find that he has made trenches and built forts that are full of loopholes, do not attack him, for it will be of no use. But if you can see him out in the open, then you can attack him because you will be able to eat him up.
The Zulus had the advantages of speed and violence, motivation. They were very keen to come to grips with the defenders of Kwajim Station at Rorkes Drift. And they were vastly outnumbering the defenders. They had a tremendous advantage of numbers.
Unfortunately, they relied on catching armies, usually in open formation, as at Ezanawana, where the Zulu impis had sighed through the overextended British lines which were possibly also suffering from a shortage of ammunition. The Rorkes Drift garrison offered a different prospect.
The Zulus did need to get close for their spears and their shields to inflict any casualties. All the time, therefore, that the British could keep them at a distance and shoot at them meant the Zulus would be at a serious disadvantage. There were 4 Zulu regiments which went on to attack Rorkes Drift. The Utlawana, the Inlondo, the Udloko, and the Indulendwe. These were senior men who had been held in reserve at the Isandlwana battle. Most of them were in their late 40s. Before the start of the battle at Rorkes Drift, they had already marched about 15 miles across country. They had swung wide of the Isandlwana mountain, crossed the Mzinzathi River, and then gone on to attack Rorkes Drift. Most of that distance had probably been covered at a pretty fast jog, so many of them were feeling the effects by the time they arrived at Rorkes Drift. They were nonetheless eager for action, having missed out on the glory at Isandlwana, and were keen to win some recognition before the day was over. There were probably around 4,000 at a rough estimate. At 4:30, less than 75 minutes after the garrison at Rorkes Drift had received news of the disaster at Isandlwana, the Zulu army made its first ferocious assault on the south wall of the barricade.
The first attack by the Zulus was put in by the Indluyengwe regiment, and they attacked the south wall of the fortifications, and they attacked with tremendous vigor and took horrific casualties before falling back.
The pace of the British musketry, the rifle fire, was so fast that the Zulus were sustaining such high casualties. There were 1 or 2 close skirmishes on the wall and 1 or 2 instances where the fighting actually came to bayonets initially, but by and large the British were able to keep the Zulus at a distance, and that's what they had to do.
At around this time, the Udloko regiment, who were older men, who were 45 years old, conducted an attack that wrapped around the small west side of the fortifications and attacked the north wall. The only thing that kept the British from being overwhelmed by these 2 regiments attacking was the fact that they were able to keep up steady, rapid fire. And they could only do that for 2 reasons. One is that the chaplain organized the wounded men to bring cartridges to the men who were shooting. And the second reason was, with tremendous foresight, the British officers commanding at Kwajim Station had ordered ammunition boxes to be opened in advance, so that there was no mucking about with trying to find the right spanner to open the ammunition box. It was all open and ready, so the British could pour out a steady stream of fire against the Zulus.
Despite the casualties they had already received, the Zulu warriors kept attacking. But as the Zulu force encroached on the barricades of Rorkes Drift, the fighting grew fiercer and the number of wounded grew by the minute.
I think it was Private Hitch who said that the Zulus on the whole took no notice whatsoever of the bullets. They just kept coming and coming, and we kept shooting them down. The only time they flinched at all was when the bayonet was used freely. Now, of course, it's a totally different sort of psychological type of warfare. Possibly in many ways the Zulus understood the bayonet more, so that's why they were a little bit more respectful of it. But ultimately it was British firepower which created so much devastation amongst the Zulu ranks, simply because the Zulus couldn't get close enough to do anything themselves.
Armed with rifles, some Zulu warriors climbed onto the hills overlooking the mission. From this position, the scarlet-coated defenders made perfect targets.
Now, when the Zulus took up their positions on the Oscarberg or Shiani terraces overlooking the post at Rorkes Drift, they were in a very good position to fire right down into Chard's defensive line. But in fact, they were firing at ranges of 300 or 400 yards, and most of them were using weapons that were really only accurate at about 100 yards, or had only been accurate at about 100 yards 20 or 30 years earlier when they were new. So they're now old weapons, rusty weapons, inadequate powder, poor quality ammunition. So the Zulus are firing away at a distance really that was too great for the sort of guns that they had. And in fact, they put a terrific volume of fire down into the post, but it was largely luck if anything hit anybody there. Although it's nonetheless interesting to note that most of Chard's casualties were still hit by gunfire at some stage during the battle. Nevertheless, the Zulu performance with regard to marksmanship was quite disappointing throughout the day.
Soon, the less than perfect Zulu marksmanship began to take its toll. If the casualties amongst the regulars were mounting fast, they were nothing compared to the appalling losses suffered by the Zulu warriors. Despite the terrible bloodshed, the intensity of the battle escalated. As dusk turned to evening, the most desperate fighting went on in the hospital, and at some point, the Zulus managed to set fire to the roof.
The hospital building was little more than a shed, really, with very small, cramped rooms.
Thing was, there weren't any doors between the rooms at the back of the hospital. So in order to get them from their rooms out through the eastern wall of the hospital, they had to cut holes in the walls with their bayonets. And wall after wall, they had to carve their way through while still turning to shoot at the Zulu attackers.
It was fought at close quarters. The roof had been set on fire. People were fighting from room to room, with the Zulus taking each room as the redcoats managed to drag the wounded through to the next one. People were digging through walls to escape the attack. It was a very tense, very claustrophobic, and for the reader or the viewer, a very exciting spectacle. But obviously for the participants, I think they might have something completely different to say about it.
One defender, Private Joseph Williams, unfortunately ran out of ammunition, was pulled through the open doorway by several Zulu, spread-eagled and disemboweled alive in front of the watching defenders. This is one of the more horrifying incidents. Other patients were burnt alive in their beds. On the whole, though, the majority of the patients were rescued from the hospital, passed through a side window into the hospital yard, which was, by that time, however, undefended.
This heroic action must rank as one of the great feats of courage seen in the whole Victorian age. Private Hook certainly deserved his Victoria Cross, rather more than the unfavourable image which Hollywood was to paint of him.
Private Hook is the one character at Rorkes Drift whose name has been somewhat maligned. He was often being described as a malingerer and a drunkard. In fact, he was from a stable lower middle class background and proved a redoubtable, heroic defender, both within the hospital area and on the outside perimeter.
He was actually the unit cook, and both before and after the battle it was he that made the tea that the British soldiers so depend upon. He was an exemplary soldier. There's no evidence from his record of him being arraigned for misconduct of any sort.
But in the film Zulu, made in 1964, James Booth played Harry Hook very well as a bit of an anti-hero, a bit of a rebel, malingerer in the hospital and not entirely a fellow of good character. And it was very effective, and it made the movie interesting, and it doesn't have a lot to do with the genuine character of Harry Hook. But Zulu was a movie. It was not a history book, and there are a lot of historical inaccuracies in it.
Seven candidates.
They are going to suck right now.
One goal.
Don't get shot, shoot them first.
It's a training regime from hell.
You need to kill faster.
Jetstream, Mondays at 9 on Military History.
In the darkness of the African night, lit only by the flames of the burning hospital, the fight for Rorkes Drift grew ever more desperate. Now completely surrounded, and having repulsed several charges, Chard ordered his men to retreat first to the middle, then to the inner walls of the kraal. Here, the British were out of range of Zulu fire from the rock terraces above. The burning hospital created both an advantage and a disadvantage in the dark. On one side, it exposed the Zulus who charged the defences. On the other, the intense shadow it cast concealed several determined attempts to break through.
When night fell, the action at Rorkes Drift had reached its crucial point. The Zulus finally had a chance to achieve what they had set out to do. It was very rare for them to fight at night, and one of the reasons why they continued to do that is obviously they felt they had the chance, now that darkness had fallen, to overcome the garrison.
There was a constant wave of Zulu attacks. There was a rattle of musketry all the time. The hospital roof was catching fire. There were attempts to set fire to other parts of the defences which were being doused by the defenders. So it really was the most dramatic occasion with the flames lighting up the events. And also, you mustn't forget the screams of the wounded and dying that you always get in action.
And their tempo of operations was such that the British had to keep shooting long after their rifles were starting to jam with dirt and from lack of cleaning. The barrels of the rifles were becoming too hot to hold because they were putting so many rounds through them. And it was a matter of continual vigilance and defense for the defenders, and a matter of heroic attack on the part of the Zulus.
By that stage, Chard and his men had been forced back to the small area in front of the storehouse. As the night wore on, under the terrible psychological and emotional stresses of combat, the men were getting desperately thirsty. There was a water cart within the perimeter, but it had unfortunately been abandoned near the hospital when everybody fell back to the storehouse.
The terrible thirst of the defenders drove them to make a sally to pull in the water cart through the biscuit box wall, the improvised biscuit box wall that was part of the defences.
Now, at this point, the Zulu attacks had been lessening in ferocity, but they were still attacking. And shortly after the sally to get the water, there was a full-scale Zulu attack at 2 a.m. And so it was tremendously risky, but it was necessary to bring that water.
If you put yourself into the shoes of the party who are ordered to go out into the pitch darkness with the Zulu chants and the noise in the middle of the African night, find a water container and bring it back into your own perimeter, that's not a mission you want to be handed to every day. It took real guts, real courage to go out there armed only with a bayonet in the darkness and bring back that water. But they were in such desperate strait that there was no alternative. Somebody had to do it, and it's typical of Rorkes Drift, where you do have these tremendously brave individual actions on both sides, that people were prepared to go out there and bring back the precious water.
By the first grey light of dawn, the spirit seems to have left the Zulu warriors. Crippled by their terrible losses, the warriors began to creep away. The morning revealed a scene of devastation. The hospital had been gutted by fire, its smoke still dirted the rising mist. And everywhere lay the dead. Among them were the few redcoats who had died near the perimeter. 15 of Chard's men were killed, but the overwhelming majority of the dead were Zulus.
When the sun came up on the morning of the 23rd of January, the British were appalled at the sight that greeted them. Rorkes Drift had been turned into something of a slaughterhouse. There were great heaps of Zulu bodies piled up against the barricades, particularly in front of the hospital, which had been charged over time and time again. Now, Chard says that in the immediate aftermath of the fight, they buried something like 350 bodies in front of the post. But he admitted later that quite a few more turned up over the subsequent weeks and months. And in fact, there are some quite reliable statistics which suggest that something like 600 Zulus were actually killed at the Battle of Rorkes Drift. Now, on top of that, of course, you've got an unknown number of wounded. Even if there were only 300 or 400 wounded on the top, which would be a very small proportion, you're looking at something like 1,000 men who sustained a wound in action. So it means that something like 1 in 4 Zulus who took part in the fight sustained some sort of injury. And there are some very graphic accounts actually which suggest that even men who survived sustained 2, 3 or even 4 wounds and then were helped away by their comrades and somehow survived.
Fascinated by the scene, Chard walked among the hundreds of corpses, littered with empty ammunition packets and cartridges, and noted the strange attitudes men had fallen in. Strangest of all, he saw that a number of Zulus had died in the same position, crouched forwards on their knees and with their faces on the ground. Although he could not have known it at that point, Lieutenant Chard and his small garrison had won their heroic struggle for survival. What they needed now was the arrival of a relief column, and fast. Chard kept his men busy. Although most were exhausted, he was careful to occupy them with routine tasks during the tense wait. One patrol was sent out to gather the Zulu weapons. They discovered many wounded Zulus were still alive. Today it would be a war crime, but in 1879, unremarked by anyone, the Redcoats simply shot the wounded Zulus they came across.
From today's perspective, the shooting of up to 200 Zulu wounded in the aftermath of the battle was morally reprehensible. In fact, many of the wounded were clubbed to death in order to save ammunition.
Hamilton Brown, who was a commander of one of the Natal Native Contingent battalions, did say that it was essentially a beastly necessity. His argument was, war is war, and savage war is the worst of the lot. He also pointed out that the Imperial troops from the 24th of Foot were extremely agitated and angered by the mutilation of the corpses of their former comrades.
I think our late 20th century concerns with the sanctity of human life have little place on a battlefield in 1879. After what these men have been through, it was really only to be expected. This was the way in which you dealt on the battlefield with men that were too badly wounded to survive.
Shortly afterwards, another disturbing development caused Chard to hurriedly call in his patrols. The Zulu warriors had returned. Chard and his men watched with mounting apprehension as they approached around the slope of the Cheyenne Mountain, kept out of rifle range and squatted down on a hill opposite. Then, after some time, they rose as one and went away. The popular belief that the Zulu were saluting the Redcoats is unlikely to be true. There are far more likely reasons for their behavior. The Zulus who fought at Rorkes Drift had been marching and fighting for 24 hours. They had crossed more than 15 miles of rugged terrain, mostly at the run. And they had been beaten once already by superior firepower of an enemy who showed no signs of weakening. They had seen a quarter of their number either wounded or killed.
The film Zulu includes a marvellous stirring moment at the end when the Zulus reappear over the skyline and start chanting songs, and the British garrison work out that the Zulus are actually saluting them for their courage. Now, it's become very much part of the sort of popular myth of the Battle of Rorkes Drift. I'm sorry to have to say in many ways that actually it didn't happen like that at all. The closest that happened was that on the morning of the 23rd, some of the Zulus, probably the rear guard because most of the rest of the Zulus had already retired overnight, came into view out of rifle range from the garrison at Rorkes Drift, and they sat down on the hill opposite, and for a few moments the two sides stared at each other before the Zulus rose up and retired back out of view. In fact, what was happening, they were probably intending to retire down towards the Mzinyati River at Rorkes Drift, but they could see Lord Chelmsford's column coming in the opposite direction, so they couldn't retire by that route, and they simply marched off in another direction. Now, it is true that both sides gained a terrific respect for each other's fighting qualities at Rorkes Drift. But the practicalities of it were that on the morning of the 23rd, everybody was far too exhausted, far too spent emotionally and physically to go in for those sort of niceties.
Rorkes Drift was saved. The Zulu War would rage on, long after the morning of the 23rd of January. But the epic defence of Rorkes Drift was over. The Redcoats were naturally elated, but a terrible blow had been dealt to the Zulu nation. The 22nd of January 1879 was a very costly day for the Zulu kingdom. The Zulus had fought not only at Isandlwana and Rorkes Drift, but also at Inyasana down on the coast. At the end of the day, they had probably the best part of 2,000 casualties. It was an appalling casualty rate, and King Cetshwayo was reported to have said, "An assegai has been thrust into the belly of the nation." Certainly there were many Zulus at the end of that day who were not quite sure whether they were victorious or defeated.
By simple virtue of the fact that the Zulus won at Isandlwana, there was very little chance of King Cetshwayo negotiating any future political settlement, because the British were then determined to crush the Zulus militarily before they instituted any peace negotiations. So not only was it a costly day in itself, it had the most apocalyptic consequences for the kingdom, because it led ultimately to the renewed invasion by the British and the great disasters at Kambula, at Gingindlovu and ultimately at Ulundi, where thousands more Zulus were killed. The great royal centres of the king's authority, the Amakanda, were all destroyed, and King Cetshwayo himself was chased off of his throne and out into the bush, and finally captured by the British and brought home as a prisoner.
In the face of the disaster at Isandlwana, the British public needed a victory. Here was a heroic feat of arms worthy of the name. The details of the battle were already being noted, and the nature of the conflict was elevated by its thrilling odds and acts of bravery from an insignificant siege to a famous victory.
The public reaction was literally ecstatic. Many music halls published songs in memory of the heroic defenders of Rorkes Drift, and huge amounts of literature were published as well. The reason for this amazing outbreak of popular hysteria can really be seen in terms of the earlier massacre at Isandlwana.
Really, Isandlwana was the more important battle, and the fact was that the British Army was defeated there on the 22nd of January. Rorkes Drift was an afterthought from a tactical point of view, but of course it provided exactly the sort of example of British courage that both the government at home and the British public wanted to see, and I think there's certainly a sense in which Rorkes Drift was made to be a much greater victory than in some ways it was.
Lieutenant Chard and Lieutenant Bromhead had both been in a state of career suspension before the battle. Chard was an engineer, and he could be promoted only on the basis of seniority, and he had to wait for people older than him in the service to die or retire. But Rorkes Drift, he's a major. Lieutenant Bromhead had been in a state of career suspension because he was deaf as a post and people didn't think he'd be much good on a battlefield. Rorkes Drift happens, promoted major. So the army needed to make all of these people into heroes to wipe out the disgrace of being defeated at Isandlwana.
11 Victoria Crosses were justly awarded for the tremendous heroism shown by the defenders of Rorkes Drift, the most for a single action in the history of the British Army.
The action at Rorkes Drift can be seen very much as a race against time. The garrison has to hold out until the prospect of relief can be got to them. To do this, they have to last out the afternoon, and that's fairly easy to do because they can see their opponents and they can keep them at a decent range. At night it becomes a different story. As darkness falls, the balance shifts into the favour of the Zulus, and they now have the opportunity to overcome the garrison, and they come very, very close to doing that. They actually squash the garrison into a smaller and smaller area, and in the end they're compacted into an area where there's a redoubt of mealie bags on the veranda, and they're getting low on ammunition, and they're just having to hold out till dawn. It's a very tense and a very time-sensitive situation.
It's not, in strategic terms, that important a battle. Almost all of the other battles in the Zulu War are of far greater strategic significance. Yet the Battle of Rorke's Drift, I think, has come to represent a certain way that the British like to remember their colonial history. The image of redcoats manning the barricades on the frontier of empire is a particularly potent one, I think. And also the conception of the enemies of the British Empire. The Zulus have come to represent a particular type of almost romanticised noble savage warrior, in a sense. These were the acceptable enemies of the empire, if you want to look at it in those terms. Brave, courageous. There was no great bitterness at the end of the war. It was a stand-up, knock-down fight between two courageous foes, and the British came out respecting their enemy. If you add into it this whole mix of redcoats and heroism in exotic locations, of standing back-to-back until the last cartridge is fired, I think you have a particularly potent mix that really strikes a number of chords in the popular consciousness, even today, considerably over a century on from the events themselves.